Next, I will talk about Australian Standard 1926.1 2012 edition. The intent of the standard is to provide pool safety barriers that reduce the risk of children under the age of 5 from drowning. It is not to provide child-proof barriers. Clause 1.3 of Australian Standard 1926.1 has a list of definitions. The 1993 edition had 9 reference terms. The 2012 edition has 25. I'll talk about a few of these. A boundary barrier is a dividing barrier between two adjoining properties. A permanent structure is a barrier or part of a barrier which cannot be removed without the use of tools. Tools are a screwdriver, spanner, wrench, shovel, cutting implement or the like. Please note that this specifically does not include the term key. Much the same as the 1993 edition, the barriers are required to be permanent, which means that they must not be able to be undone or removed without the use of a tool. A key lock assembly is not compliant. The minimum barrier height remains the same at 1.2 metres. The 2012 edition has 5 non-climbable zones. Non-climbable zone 1 to 4 apply to internal barriers, and non-climbable zone 5 applies to a boundary barrier. The following diagrams will help explain how these work. For those who have a copy of the standard handy, please refer to clause 2.2. Under the 1993 standard, there was a requirement to have at least 1100 millimetres between the top of the fence and the highest lower foothold. Additionally, there was a requirement to have at least 900 millimetres between the highest lower foothold and the lowest higher handhold. These have been replaced with the non-climbable zone 1 requirements. Non-climbable zone 1 is measured within the fence and aims at ensuring that the fence itself is not climbable. It is at least 900 millimetres in height and can be located anywhere within the vertical plane of the fence. The 1993 edition detailed that there were to be no climbable objects within a 1.2 metre arc measured from the top of the fence on the outside of the fence. This has been replaced with non-climbable zones 2 and 3. Non-climbable zone 2 is measured from the top of non-climbable zone 1. It is a 900 millimetre arc on the outside of the fence between 3 o'clock and 6 o'clock. There are to be no climbable objects within this area. Non-climbable zone 3 is measured from the top of the fence. It is a 900 millimetre arc on the outside of the fence between 12 o'clock and 3 o'clock. It also extends down to the top of non-climbable zone 1 and non-climbable zone 2. There are to be no climbable objects within this area. Non-climbable zone 4 is measured on the pool side of the fence, where the fence has gaps exceeding 10 millimetres. It aligns with non-climbable zone 1 and is 300 millimetres deep. There are to be no climbable objects within this area. Under the 1993 edition, an internal fence could be climbable if it was either 2.4 metres high or 1.8 metres high with a 450 millimetre crank on top. Under the 2012 edition, a climbable barrier is permitted if it is at least 1.8 metres high. This means that the non-climbable zones do not apply to a barrier exceeding 1.8 metres in height. Example of this type of barrier includes chain link fencing and lattice. Under the 1993 edition, as well as Regulation 50 of Building Regulations 2012, a boundary fence had to be at least 1.2 metres high and non-climbable on one side or on the other. Under the 2012 edition, the boundary fence is required to be at least 1.8 metres high. Non-climbable zone 5 applies from the top of the fence on the pool side of the fence. The opposite side, or the non-pool side of the fence, is permitted to be climbable. There are specific requirements for when a boundary barrier intersects an internal barrier. Non-climbable zone 5 is measured from the top of the boundary fence. It is a 900 millimetre arc on the pool side of the fence between 3 o'clock and 6 o'clock. There are to be no climbable objects within this area. There are specific requirements for where an internal pool barrier intersects with a boundary barrier. If the internal pool barrier is greater than 50 millimetres wide, the internal barrier must be at least 1.8 metres high within 900 millimetres of the boundary barrier. If the internal barrier is less than 50 millimetres wide, the internal barrier can be 1.2 metres high as long as it is not located within 45 degrees of the boundary barrier. If it is located within 45 degrees of the boundary barrier, it is to be at least 1.8 metres in height. Where a barrier has a component that may provide a handhold or foothold and it is within a non-climbable zone, a 60-degree chamfer may be used to make it unclimbable. This only applies where the barrier is solid or where the gap between the verticals is 10 mm or less. Although the standard permits gaps between vertical members of up to 100 mm to use the chamfer, Regulation 15B of the Building Regulations 2012 modifies the standard in this instance and corrects it to apply in a similar fashion to the 1993 edition. I have marked in red the additional text from the regulations, and you may want to add this to the text in your standard. I also suggest the modification of figure 2.6a. Where the figure details 100 mm between the vertical members, we suggest striking this out and replacing it with 10 mm. This is an example of the 60-degree chamfer. Where an internal barrier adjoins another internal barrier, the non-climbable zones 1 and 2 transfer across 900 mm into that adjoining barrier. This also applies when adjoining a climbable 1.8 metre high barrier. Here's an example of that. You will note that where the pool fence meets the masonry, non-climbable zone 1 and 2 continue onto the masonry. Also, where the pool fence meets the timber fence, the non-climbable zone 1 and 2 continue across onto the timber fence. Where the internal pool barrier is greater than 50 mm in width and intersects a boundary fence, the non-climbable zone 1 and 2 continue from the 1.2 metre high portion to the 1.8 metre high portion of the internal fence. Where the internal pool barrier is less than 50 mm in width and intersects a boundary barrier, the non-climbable zone 2 and 3 from the internal barrier covers part of the boundary fence. Clause 2.3.1 identifies that barriers must have no climbable objects, retaining walls or level changes within 500 mm of the barrier that reduce the effective height of the barrier. In this example, the green section underneath the non-climbable zone 2 is to be clear of climbable objects, retaining walls or level changes. Perforated materials or meshes are similar to the 1993 edition. Gaps less than 13 mm are permitted within a non-climbable zone. Gaps between 13 mm and 100 mm can be used in a barrier that is at least 1.8 metres high. Gaps exceeding 100 mm are not permitted. The old standard required a strainer wire at the top and the bottom of the barrier. This has been removed and replaced with tests. The barrier shall not be able to be reduced to a height of less than 1.2 metres by the addition of a 25 kg weight. And a gap under the barrier shall not be able to be formed that is more than 100 mm under the application of a 100 Newton upwards force, that is approximately 10 kilos. The 1993 edition was silent on glass barriers. The 2012 edition specifically addresses them. The standard details that glass barriers are to be compliant with Australian Standard 1288. Generally, glass pool fences need to be Type A safety glass. Indentations, projections or gaps exceeding 10 mm are considered to be a handhold or foothold if located within non-climbable zone 1. Sloping and stepped barriers shall be measured perpendicularly to the ground surface beneath. For stepped areas, the barrier should be measured perpendicular to the nosing line. In this diagram, you can see the non-climbable zone and fence height being measured perpendicularly to the slope of the ground or the slope of the nosing line. The same as the 1993 edition, the maximum gap between vertical members is 100 mm. The maximum gap under a fence or gate is 100 mm. The surface under a fence or gate should be durable and not easily excavated. Clause 2.4 covers gates, gate units and latch fittings. As per the 1993 edition, gates are required to swing outwards, away from the pool area. Sliding gates are not permitted. Gates must be self-closing and self-latching when released from any open position. This includes resting on the gate latch to fully open. The 2012 edition details that gates must swing clear of any building or doorway. The diagram on the left is a non-compliant gate, as it swings into the building or into the doorway. The diagram on the right shows that by setting the gate back from the doorway, the gate can be compliant. Gate latches shall be at least 1.5 metres high above ground level. Alternatively, gate latches shall be located on the inside of the gate, be shielded and located in accordance with the specific requirements of this standard. The requirement for a gate latch release to be located at least 1.4 metres high above the highest lower gate member has been removed in this edition. The diagram on the left shows a latch release located at least 1.5 metres high. The diagram on the right shows a shielded gate latch, which is identical to the 1993 edition. Gate hinges are specifically addressed within this standard. Hinges located within non-climbable zone 1 or 2 with an upper surface greater than 10 mm are not permitted unless the top of them are fitted with a 60-degree chamfer. Clause 2.5 covers retaining walls. For retaining walls located above the pool area, they must not slope by more than 15 degrees away from the pool. If the retaining wall forms part of the barrier to the pool, it must be at least 1.8 metres high. So essentially a child must drop 1.8 metres into a pool area. Under the old standard, the requirement was 2.4 metres. For retaining walls located below the pool area, they must not slope more than 15 degrees towards the pool. If the retaining wall forms part of the barrier to the pool, there are two options. It must be at least 1.8 metres high, or it must be at least 1.2 metres high if it has compliant non-climbable zones. Under the old standard, the requirement was 2.4 metres, or similarly 1.2 metres high and non-climbable. A new addition to the standard is how to deal with the intersection of a pool barrier with a retaining wall. If you look at figure 210D of the standard, this should be on page 23, you will see a diagram for this. Where intersections of a barrier and retaining wall occur, the barrier must extend 900 mm as an overhang or return at the edge of the retaining wall. Where a 900 mm return is used, it must be flush with the face of the retaining wall. However, there is no requirement to panel over the fence to remove the gaps. Clause 253 covers out-of-ground pool walls. This is primarily aimed at swimming pools that have a wall section protruding from out of the ground and acting as part of the barrier. If the pool wall complies with the other parts of the standard, such as height and non-climbable zones, then it may form part of the safety barrier. Clause 254 details that permanent bodies of water can be used as a pool barrier. The body of water must be permanent, at least 300 mm deep and at least 1.8 metres wide. This is particularly suitable for canal developments that form the rear boundary of a property. The body of water must be permanent and discussions with the local government and Department of Water are recommended. Clause 2.6 covers child-resistant windows. The 1993 standard had three requirements depending on the windowsill height. If the windowsill was less than 900 mm from the floor level, the openable portion of the window needed to be restricted by a security screen or by a permanent device that restricted the opening to not exceed 100 mm. If the windowsill was greater than 900 mm but less than 1200 mm from the floor level, the openable portion of the window needed to be restricted by a securely fixed fly screen. There were no requirements for windows with a sill above 1.2 metres. Under the new standard, if the windowsill is less than 1800 mm from the floor level on the pool side, the openable portion of the window needs to be permanently restricted to open no more than 100 mm. Alternatively, the openable portion should be protected by a security screen. If the windowsill is 1800 mm or above the floor level, there are no restrictions required. Clause 2.7 covers child-resistant door sets. The 1993 standard did not detail where doors could or could not be used. This was addressed in the regulations. Also, the standard was silent on the direction of opening when it came to doors, with the general application being that doors could swing or slide in any direction. Under the new standard, Doors are only permitted to be used for indoor pools or for the indoor portion of an indoor-outdoor pool. Doors must be self-closing and self-latching when released from any open position, from fully open to resting on the latch. Doors must have a latch release located at least 1.5 metres high. Doors are not permitted to open towards the pool area, but may open away or may slide sideways. Additionally, pet doors are not permitted, and Non-climbable Zone 1 applies within the bottom 1.2 metres of the door. Here is a diagram of a child-resistant door set. The bottom 1.2 metres must have a 900mm high non-climbable zone located somewhere within it. Clause 2.8 addresses balcony requirements. The 1993 edition required the balustrade of a balcony to comply with the pool barrier requirements if the distance between the balcony floor level and the pool surrounds was less than 2.4 metres. The 2012 edition is different. It details that if a balcony projects into the non-climbable zone of a barrier, the balcony balustrade must comply with the pool barrier requirements. The standard is silent on the circumstance of a balcony projecting into a pool area other than into a non-climbable zone. As such, we have made an interpretation based upon the retaining wall and window comparative clauses. If a balcony projects into a pool area and the finished floor level is less than 1.8 metres from the pool area ground level, the balcony balustrade must comply with the pool barrier requirements. Clause 2.9 is for above ground pools. Similar to the 1993 edition, the walls of an above ground pool can form part of the pool barrier as long as it complies with the various provisions such as height and non-climbable zones. Additionally, however, there is a requirement for a fence and gate to be provided around any fixed ladder, or if the ladder is portable, around a designated entry point. Section 3 covers the loading and testing requirements for the barrier. Additional tests have been added for gates, which came from the now defunct Australian Standard 2820. The tests are primarily manufacturer type tests, and it is not recommended that pool inspectors use these tests out in the field. The test for the strength and rigidity of openings has changed from the 1993 standard, which is the cone type object that gets pulled through an opening in the barrier. The standard now details that the appendix is to be used by manufacturers to gain certification for their barrier. It is not designed for in-field testing. To verify that a barrier is compliant with any of these tests, you should request from the manufacturer or supplier a copy of the test report that demonstrates compliance. The test report should meet the BCA evidence of suitability requirements. You may need to work with the building surveyor to establish that the test report complies. I've been asked whether or not it is okay to continue to use the test object from the 1993 edition Appendix A out in the field. The use of the test object will only ever give you an indication as to whether the product complies. You cannot rely upon it. The only way to know for sure is by getting a test report. Australian Standard 1926.2 is also referenced in the Building Code. It addresses the location requirements for pool barriers. It is important that you use the correct version, which is the 2007 edition incorporating Amendments 1 and 2. The standard defines various terms. These include outdoor pool, which is a pool that is neither fully nor partly enclosed by a building. An indoor pool, which is a pool that is fully enclosed within a residential building or a separate building. An indoor-outdoor pool, which is a pool that is partly enclosed by a building and partly an outdoor pool. I have provided some examples of post-May 2016 pool barrier layouts. These are typical layouts of an outdoor pool. The first diagram shows a pool with a pool barrier incorporating a boundary fence, wall of the house, child-resistant windows, and internal pool fence with gate. The second diagram shows a pool with an internal isolation fence and gate. This slide shows a Class 10A building, such as a shed, located within and as part of the pool barrier. The first diagram shows that the doors and windows of the shed are not required to be restricted. The second diagram shows that as the shed forms part of the barrier, the wall of the shed and window are required to comply with 1926.1. Note that the door is not permitted even if it is a child-resistant door set, as child-resistant door sets are not permitted in a barrier to an outdoor pool. They are only permitted to be used in the barrier to an indoor pool or the indoor portion of an indoor-outdoor pool. The diagram on the left shows an indoor spa. Note that the immediate doors and windows are compliant with the standard. The diagram on the right shows an indoor-outdoor pool, which are a rarity in Western Australia. The indoor portion of the indoor-outdoor pool must be enclosed by the building, otherwise it is not indoors. As such, the outdoor portion of an indoor-outdoor pool must be segregated from the indoor portion by construction, like a wall. If a door is located in this segregation, that is, the door is common to the indoor and outdoor parts, the door is not required to be child resisting. Scenario 1. An owner of a pre-May 2016 pool wants to replace an old pool fence with a new one. What is required? Firstly, he needs to get a building permit. The applicable building standard for that building permit are either the post-May 2016 requirements or the pre-May 2016 requirements. There is the choice of both sets of requirements as the pool is a pre-May 2016 pool. At the completion of the work, the builder must submit the BA7 notice of completion to the permit authority. Additionally, if the building permit has listed the required inspection for the pool safety barriers, an inspection certificate complying with Regulation 28 and 29 is required to accompany the BA7. Scenario 2. The owner of a pre-May 2016 pool wants to install a new spa inside the existing pool barrier area. What is required? The first step is to get a building permit for both the spa and the pool barriers. Both can be on the same permit, or they may be on separate permits. Even though the pool barriers are existing, where changes need to occur in order to achieve compliance with the post-May 2016 requirements, these need to be addressed in a building permit. The applicable building standard for the building permit are the post-May 2016 requirements, being the current BCA at the time of application. If an alternative solution is proposed for the pool safety barriers, it must meet the performance requirements of the building code and must be approved by the permit authority. Many parts of the existing pool barrier, if not the entire thing, may already be compliant with the post-May 2016 requirements. However, where areas do not comply, they will need to be upgraded. At completion of the work, the builder must submit the BA7 notice of completion to the permit authority. Additionally, if the building permit that includes the pool safety barrier has listed the required inspection for the pool safety barriers, an inspection certificate complying with Regulation 28 and 29 is required to accompany the BA7. Scenario 3. Can a front fence facing the street comply as a pool barrier? Yes. The definition of boundary barrier is a dividing barrier between two adjoining properties. As the verge is not part of the allotment, it is an adjoining property. As such, the front fence needs to comply with the boundary barrier requirements. 1.8 metres tall, 900mm non-climbable zone 5 internally, with the outside permitted to be climbable. The barrier is also permitted to be permeable. That concludes the information session on the changes to the rules for pool barriers. I hope the information has been useful. Should you have any queries, you are welcome to contact the Building Commission.